September 1944. After months of vicious fighting, tanks from the U.S. 3rd Armored Division reach the frontier of Nazi Germany, confident the war is in its final days.
The Allies did think that the war was going to be over by Christmas.
But German forces put up a furious defense of the fatherland.
And they just picked off our tanks, 1, 2, 3, 4, just like they were in a shooting gallery.
Against battle-hardened opponents, the Americans quickly learned that invading Germany will be a long and bloody campaign.
The army
was fighting to stop the enemy from entering the fatherland.
As both sides roll out their newest armored titans in the battle for Germany.
The tank that we got into was that one-of-a-kind tank.
It was a fight right on to the very end.
Western Germany, near the border with Belgium. In the closing months of World War II, this was a scene of intense fighting as Allied forces battled their way into the fatherland, mile by bloody mile. Since the D-Day landings in June of 1944, American, British, and Canadian tanks have overwhelmed the Germans occupying France. Throughout the summer months, fierce armored battles steadily pushed the enemy back.
The German withdrawal was very chaotic. The Germans referred to it as the void. There was a lack of communication. Units were fighting in isolation. It was very difficult. They all knew that they had to go towards Germany to find safety.
And by September, the Allies are nearing the German frontier. The attack into Germany will be spearheaded by the U.S. 3rd Armored Division. The first obstacle they face is a series of defensive fortifications known as the West Wall, or Siegfried Line, that the Germans have built along the border.
Siegfried Line was similar to the Maginot Line that France had built. They would have had a number of bunkers, a lot of established fortifications that were there to turn certain areas into kill zones.
Though it looks impressive, with hundreds of kilometers of anti-tank barriers known as Dragon's Teeth, advanced scouts from the 3rd Armored Division discover weak spots in the line. Then they come up with a simpler way to get through the German defenses.
They brought up bulldozers and bulldozed dirt up over the Siegfried Line so the other tanks and trucks and everything else could run up over the top of it just to push more material and more people into Germany. My tank was back about 8 tanks. We weren't being shot at the moment, so I could take my periscope and look around and see what was going on. I could see the dragon's teeth and that sort of thing, so I knew we were going on by them. We thought once we got through the Siegfried Line, you know, they'd say, well, you know, they're inside, we might as well quit.
The Allies did think that the war was going to be over by Christmas. A lot of them did, at least.
They are the first invading army to cross the German frontier in force since the age of Napoleon. So the Americans are uncertain of how the enemy will fight. By late 1944, much of Germany lies in ruins. Its cities have been bombed relentlessly, its armed forces decimated. Now, to finish the war and put an end to Hitler's Third Reich, the Americans assemble a massive invasion force from the U.S. First Army, with 100,000 combat soldiers, hundreds of artillery guns, and more than 1,200 tanks, including 850 of their armored workhorse, the Sherman. The M4A1 has a short-barreled, low-velocity 75mm main gun with an effective range of just 800 meters. And with only 51mm of frontal armor, it's vulnerable to German high-velocity cannons.
All the way through training, I was just impressed with this tank. You know, it was 32 tons of steel. It would go about 30 miles an hour. You could crank it up. You know, inside, you felt like you were really secure.
The Allied plan has British and Canadian forces pushing towards northern Germany, while the Americans take the southern route. The 3rd Armored Division is ordered to advance along the open corridor south of Aachen, the first city over the border.
That was a supposedly easy route to cross the Ruhr River, get to the Rhine, and then establish crossings, and then from there it was, you know, going to be the end.
At a road junction, tanks from E Company halt as their commander decides which way to go.
They told you in basic training 1,000,000 times, don't stop at T intersections. Because the Germans always have it zeroed in. But I had to get out and smoke a cigarette, and sure enough, while they're trying to decide where to go, right or left out of that intersection, the Germans dropped in a whole bunch of artillery shells. My tank commander screamed at me to get back in the tank, which I did in a hurry, and then off we went. For a moment, there was, you know, almost a panic. You know, where else are they?
The Americans have run into forward units of the German 9th Panzer Division.
Die Armee
The army was fighting to stop the enemy from entering the fatherland.
Vaterland zu lassen.
They were defending Germany. They weren't Nazis at this point. I mean, you're defending your homeland. You've got an invader coming in, and that's where the buck stops, at the border.
The Americans quickly move on, away from the enemy guns, and continue their advance. 2 platoons of tanks from E Company approach a small town. This time, they are more cautious and split their forces in 2.
There was a small town. It had houses only on both sides of the road. Behind this row of houses, there was a hill, and on this side, there was a big open field and then a slag pile from the coal mine. 4 tanks went on the outside of those houses. The 4 tanks that I was with went right up through the middle of town. So we were all just really alert.
But the Germans have anticipated this American tactic.
And all of a sudden, you heard firing and you heard screaming and yelling. And the Germans had anti-tank guns dug into that slag pile.
Targeting the Americans is the deadliest anti-tank gun of the war, the German 88. The 88mm gun has armor-piercing shells that can penetrate 100mm of steel at distances of up to 1,500 meters. More than enough power to penetrate the frontal armor of a Sherman tank.
The one that everybody talked about was the German 88. It had a very high muzzle velocity, so their trajectory was almost flat. And they just picked off our tanks, 1, 2, 3, 4. Just like they were in a shooting gallery. So my tank, we stopped hiding behind a house. And then they said, okay, back out of town. So we turned around and went back out of town.
Half of E Company's tanks are destroyed in a matter of minutes. And the 3rd Armored Division's advance is slowed. Fighting along Germany's western border is proving costly for the Americans. The 3rd Armored Division began their advance to Germany with 400 tanks. But enemy resistance has left them with less than 100 tanks that are operational, and they still have 650 kilometers between them and Berlin. October 1944. Fresh U.S. reinforcements arrive, and the American 3rd Armored Division prepares to resume its assault on Germany. But the fighting near the border has delayed their advance and allowed the Germans to bolster their defenses. The first city inside Germany that the Allies plan to seize is Aachen.
The Allies went through the Aachen area because it was considered a route through the heavily forested, heavily mountainous area of Western Germany. That area, if it were under Allied control, would have allowed the funneling of resources relatively easily into the Rhineland and central Germany.
Most of its civilian population has been evacuated, and the Germans have created fortified positions throughout the city, as well as on the approach routes. For the defense of Aachen, the Germans have 18,000 troops, 240 artillery guns, and nearly 60 tanks and assault guns. Hitler also calls up some 5,000 members of the local militia, the Volkssturm. Made up of boys and men aged from 16 to 60, they are poorly trained and only lightly armed. And Hitler gives the order that all of Aachen's defenders must stand firm against the Americans or die at their posts.
We could not retreat, not even a meter. We had to hold our position, and if we did not, we knew we would be shot. That is why we endured all this.
The Americans have assembled 80,000 troops and more than 300 tanks for their assault. They plan to encircle Aachen. The 2nd Armored Division will attack from north of the city, while the 3rd Armored attacks from the south. Shermans from the 3rd Armored Division's 33rd Armored Regiment are ordered to proceed towards Aachen. But first, they must face the battle-hardened veterans of the 116th Panzer Division.
They were good fighters. Some of them been fighting for years, you know, fighting the Russians, and now they brought them back from that front and put them in this front. Yeah, and they fought to the last man, you know, to keep you out.
The terrain south of Aachen provides a defending army with many positions from which to ambush attackers. The Americans advance cautiously, unsure of where or when they may meet the tanks of the 116th. The Panzer IV is the most widely used tank in the German arsenal. It is armed with a high-velocity 75mm gun and boasts 80mm of frontal armor, more than the Sherman. But its sides are vulnerable to the American tank, having only 30mm of armor.
You were hoping you didn't have to have a battle with them head-on. What we were trying to hit was the side of them. To hit them front-on was a waste of your ammunition. You had to get them from the side. Tactic was to get somebody over here to start shooting at the German tank. And in order for him to shoot at this tank, he had to maneuver his tank around to get some protection. And when he maneuvered his tank around, then somebody else on this side had a better shot.
The side shot misses the Panzer IV. A Sherman approaches head-on, and the German crew capitalizes on this opportunity.
All of a sudden, a lieutenant showed up, Lieutenant Bear, and told my tank commander to get out, that he was going to take over that tank. Lieutenant Bear had lost 2 tanks that day already. When he got into my tank, he just stood there for a minute. And we looked at him, and the man was just completely battle fatigued, really. And all of a sudden, one of the other sergeants called over the radio and said, "Lieutenant, back up. They're shooting at you." When he said that, I turned my periscope around like this, and I saw a big fireball go by me. And then finally he reached up and he had to squeeze this little mic so he could talk. And he said, "Driver, back up." I could see the driver had it in reverse and was gunning the engine. And as soon as he said that, bang. Shell hit and went right through the gunner and right through the tank commander and killed them both instantly. The tank driver had gotten out, and so I dove out of the turret, down into the tank driver's seat, out over the side. And just as I went out over the side, the tank got hit the second time, and this time it started to burn and explode. We would have had 10 tanks, and we ended up after that battle with only 4.
The Americans fight their way into Aachen on the 13th of October. The Germans suffer 5,000 casualties and more than 5,000 captured trying to hold the city. But on October 21st, Aachen surrenders to the Americans, the first city in the fatherland to fall to the Allies. Now central Germany lies before the 3rd Armored Division.
The thought kept going through your mind, well, they'll quit now. When they didn't, that was what really came as a surprise.
In November, American troops encounter some of their worst combat of the war in the Hürtgen Forest southeast of Aachen. With their troops tired from months of fighting, their invasion of Germany stalls. A stalemate sets in on the front lines. The 3rd Armored Division works to repair damaged tanks and prepare for the next phase of the war. On December 16, 1944, it is the Germans who launch a massive armored offensive, taking the Allies by surprise. The Battle of the Bulge. The German plan is to slice through enemy lines and drive towards Antwerp, trapping more than 1 million Allied troops. But after 6 weeks of bitter fighting, the German offensive grinds to a halt, blunted by Allied reinforcements. Hitler's gamble proves costly, losing hundreds of much-needed Panzers in the fighting.
After the Ardennes offensive, that essentially expended Germany's operational capacities on the Western Front. The remainder of it was defensive and reactionary as opposed to actually initiating and setting the tone for momentum or an attack.
As the Germans retreat in the west, the Soviet Union launches its own offensive on the Eastern Front. The Red Army smashes its way through German lines in the Balkans, East Prussia, and Poland. By early February, Soviet tanks are just 80 kilometers from Berlin. On the Western Front, the Allies now resume their invasion of Germany. Their first objective is to seize bridges over the Rhine River, the last natural barrier to central Germany. Tanks from the 1st Canadian Army are to advance through what's known as the Hochwald Gap and capture key bridges on the Rhine near the German town of Xanten. But as the Canadians move into Germany, they must overcome fierce resistance.
You have to take into account, here's the Germans. Their very livelihood depends on preventing the Allies from seizing the bridges. If the Canadians seize the bridges, it's no time until they've surrounded the Ruhr and their lifeline is finished. And they were able to hold a force 5 times their size at bay for 31 days.
After weeks of intense combat, the Canadians overcome German resistance, and their armor finally reaches the Rhine River. And as they cross it and move deeper into Germany, they see the effect of the war on the civilian population.
We were approaching this small town. It was called Wesel. Prior to us arriving there, the British or Canadian Typhoon rocket plane came in with their rockets and strafed the town, and they just messed that town up terribly. And we were walking through the town at the time, and man, we couldn't believe it. Rubble on either side piled up. The homes are totally gone. What people were around, they had carts, and they were picking the bodies up and putting them in carts. The bodies looked like mannequins, you know, like a statue, like you see in the store. And they were all in the debris and everything else.
In the first 2 months of 1945, the Germans lose close to 1,000 tanks. Over 500,000 soldiers and civilians become casualties as they try to prevent total defeat.
A lot of the Germans that were coming up to the front were passing through a lot of the urbanized areas that had been bombed by the U.S. and Britain, and that added to their resolve. They'd seen what they'd done to civilians, they wanted a little payback, so some of these groups were motivated.
Aber bei vielen Kameraden,
My fellow soldiers, whose homes had been destroyed, they said, "What am I supposed to do at home? I would rather take another American with me to the grave."
dann nehme ich lieber noch ein paar Amis mit, so war der Ausdruck.
And it is German troops like these that the U.S. 3rd Armored Division must now face as they resume their advance. They are tasked with helping to capture the biggest Allied target in Western Germany, Cologne. By seizing this city on the Rhine River, the division can open a route into central Germany.
We knew that when we got back into combat, it was going to be to head towards Cologne. It was quite an objective, and the Germans didn't want to give it up. We had a real battle on our hands with the tanks.
The Americans will make a frontal assault on Cologne, Germany's 3rd largest city, with tanks leading the way. Cologne has been bombed repeatedly. Street after street lies in ruins, providing the defending German troops and their Panther and Tiger tanks countless number of positions from which to ambush the Americans.
There was so much bomb damage. The buildings were all collapsed, and the streets were very narrow, and we had obstacles all over. Everything was bombed, except the cathedral. That was good shape. I recall our lieutenant said, "Gentlemen, I give you Cologne. Let's knock the hell out of it." The Germans zeroed in on us with artillery. At first I thought they were bombing us. There's such big explosions all around.
The Sherman tanks are outgunned by Panther and Tiger tanks defending Cologne. But the Germans don't realize the Americans of the 3rd Armored Division will be attacking with a new weapon, the Pershing tank. The T-26E3 Pershing tank is America's answer to Germany's fearsome Tiger. This heavy tank boasts an impressive 100 millimeters of frontal armor and a lethal 90 millimeter main gun with a killing range of 1,500 meters. But the Pershing has not yet been tested in urban combat. On March 6, 1945, it gets its baptism of fire in the streets of Cologne.
We finally moved into this intersection. A German tank had come into the intersection to my left. And just far enough that he saw us and he backed away. I fired armor-piercing shells through the building. I figured maybe I will get a lucky hit. The top of the building collapsed and fell on top of the German tank. They couldn't turn their gun. They couldn't rotate the turret. There was so much rubble on there that they abandoned the tank and were captured.
The Americans continue to advance towards the city center. They are guided by the towers of the medieval Cathedral of St. Peter that loom over Cologne.
You could see that from a distance, you know. You see the spirals up from the top of the cathedral.
As they near it, the Americans' progress is hindered by a deadly enemy tank. The Panther is armed with a high-velocity 75 millimeter main gun, capable of hitting targets over 1,000 meters away. It has 80 millimeters of frontal armor, but sloped, this becomes effectively 145 millimeters of protection.
We headed down toward the cathedral. As we got closer, we found that the German tank had fired from the plaza in front of the cathedral and knocked out one of our tanks. Our Sherman tanks were not very good. They were no match for the Panthers anyway.
The Americans bail out of their burning tank, but 3 of the 5 crew die. To defeat the enemy tank, the Pershing must outflank the Panther.
D Company radioed over to us and asked us to go down and get the German. Supposedly his gun's pointing toward them, not at us, you know. As we went into the intersection, the driver had his periscope turned, looking up toward the German tank. As he came into the intersection, he saw their gun coming around to meet us. And instead of stopping, he floored the throttle down and went roaring right out into the middle of the intersection.
Unlike its opponent, the Pershing is equipped with a gyro stabilizer, a device that allows the main gun to be fired with accuracy, even while the tank is in motion.
As soon as I could, I fired once, I hit him, and I fired again. And again, to make sure nobody was going to be firing back. After the third shot, they burst into flames.
The Panther tank burns for 2 days. By March 7th, the Americans mop up the last pockets of resistance, and Cologne's defenders surrender. March 7th is a fateful day for the Third Reich. The same day, Cologne is captured. A crucial bridge over the Rhine is seized at nearby Remagen. And American armor is soon pouring across it to the eastern side of the river, including tanks from the 3rd Armored Division.
Ja, wie die Kämpfe immer
And the fighting got closer and closer and reached the bridge at Remagen, we were thinking, it is over.
sowieso aus.
The 3rd Armored Division is now less than 600 kilometers from Berlin. But between them and the German capital is the Ruhr Valley, Germany's industrial heartland. And 500,000 Nazi troops determined to protect their nation at all cost. March 23, 1945. The Allies launched their offensive into the Ruhr region. The attack will be a classic pincer movement, with the 9th U.S. Army attacking from the north, and the 1st U.S. Army attacking from the south. If they succeed, over 350,000 soldiers from Germany's Army Group B will be trapped. But the Germans are led by one of the finest defensive commanders of the war, Field Marshal Walter Model. To defeat him, the Americans must destroy his panzer forces. So the 3rd Armored Division is ordered to make a dash towards the city of Paderborn.
Paderborn was a very important post for us. That's where the main Panzer schools were. That's why we were headed up in that direction.
The Americans fear the German panzers based at the Paderborn Training Center will mount a counterattack. So the city must be captured, and quickly.
This drive from Marburg to Paderborn, about 90 miles, 144 kilometers, and we did it in 1 day.
I believe it was the longest drive of any armored formation for the U.S. during World War II.
March 30th, 1945. A unit of Sherman supported by a Pershing from the 3rd Armored Division's 32nd Armored Regiment spearhead the assault.
We attacked early in the morning. Took off and up the road as fast as we could go. The Germans were surprised. They weren't expecting it. Along the way, going up toward Paderborn, there was a large gun. Was setting up on our right side. I fired and hit it. And took off again and drove hell-bent down the road. We kept moving, so we wouldn't be a sitting target.
In their haste to advance to Paderborn, the American tanks have bypassed a powerful German panzer group that now counterattacks.
So you had a lot of units that were in training that just went right to the fight from Paderborn, and they were able to kind of get in behind the spearheads, create some confusion.
The tank commander grabbed me by the shoulder and said, "Take the tank." And here a Mark V German Panther coming down behind us. So I had HE, an explosive shell in the chamber. Turned the turret as hard as I could to come around. I fired the explosive shell. and got an armor-piercing shell in, came around and pulled the trigger and hit him right dead center in the front, right at the heaviest part of the armor, and it penetrated, went right on through, knocked him out. It was a tough fight all the way. Out of all the tanks, well, 15 tanks attacking down there, only 2 of us made it.
The battle for Paderborn is fierce and bloody. But after 3 days of fighting, the Americans overwhelm its defenders, who surrender on April 1st. That day, U.S. forces complete their encirclement of the Ruhr region, sealing the fate of Army Group B. The commander of the defeated German forces, Field Marshal Walter Model, commits suicide rather than surrender.
The capture of the Ruhr industrial region in Western Germany would have crippled what was left of the Germans' ability to manufacture aircraft, tanks, pretty much their ability to conduct the war.
The days of the Third Reich are now numbered. Soviet artillery begins to shell Berlin on April 20th, the birthday of Adolf Hitler. He calls for reinforcements in a last-ditch effort at holding off the Red Army.
With the resources being diverted to the Eastern Front, it was very difficult for the Germans to compete on an equal footing with their American and British counterparts.
As they move eastward and closer to Berlin, the 3rd Armored Division encounters little opposition in the small villages and towns, as many enemy troops simply surrender at the sight of American tanks. The Americans' next objective is Dessau, the last major city protecting the highway to Berlin. It is just 130 kilometers from the German capital, and defended by some of Hitler's most fanatical troops. April 21st, 1945. Troops and tanks of the 3rd Armored Division prepare for the assault on Dessau.
When we were making our move, the whole task force was going. And I had never seen them all at one time. Our own 32nd Armored was in the northeast. And that's where the last remnants of the fighting was going on.
Though Dessau is in ruins, the German garrison here has been reinforced with Hitler's most powerful tank. The King Tiger is the largest tank the Germans have built. Also called the Royal Tiger, it weighs 70 tons and has 150 millimeters of frontal armor, and is armed with a high-velocity 88 millimeter main gun that is more than 6 meters long. Hitler believes the King Tiger can outmatch any Allied tank and help turn the tide of war. Though immense, it is surprisingly agile. And in the ruins of Dessau, one waits to ambush the enemy. The 33rd Armored Regiment of the 3rd Armored Division slowly makes its way into Dessau. And with the Americans is their own iron giant, the Super Pershing, America's answer to the King Tiger.
The Super Pershing was definitely the next stage of the evolution of American armor. Only one Super Pershing was used in combat in World War II.
The Super Pershing is an upgraded version of the Pershing tank. It has 140 millimeters of frontal armor and a new long-barreled 90 millimeter main gun that can penetrate more than 200 millimeters of steel.
The tank that we got into was that one-of-a-kind tank. This was a case where this Tiger Royal, this is the big guy, one of the few that I saw at this end of the war. And he was the one that was waiting for us.
For the only time in the war, a King Tiger is about to face off with a Super Pershing in a duel.
And they fired at us as we came around the corner. Fortunately, their shot went high. And so I fired at them, and I hit them. Glanced a pretty serious blow. And then I got ready to fire and hit them again. They were coming toward us, and they were coming up over a pile of rubble. And the underside of their tank was completely exposed. And when I hit that thing, it exploded with all that ammo and everything. It destroyed that tank. Tank commander, he was surprised. He said, "Great shot, kid. You really did it."
As the clash of these armored titans ends, the crew of the Super Pershing has little time to savor the victory as the battle for Dessau continues to rage around them. In the final days of World War II, the Americans control much of the city of Dessau. Yet the German defenders still hold out, knowing that if the city falls, the road to Berlin will be open.
We're well into Germany. We're past the Rhine. You know, surely they'll quit. They didn't. You know, it was a fight right on to the very end.
The battle becomes street to street. American 3rd Armored Division tanks support infantry, clearing out the last pockets of resistance.
We continued, dude. I mean, that wasn't the end of the war for us. I mean, we were still in Dessau, and we were taking the city to the end. As we were driving, we got fired on by a Panzer. And it did glance a blow off of us. Now, they had to turn their turrets around. They didn't have a power traverse like we had. And so it took time. And so while he was doing that, I told our driver, I said, "Let's get out of here. I want to get it located, but we want to get that guy." There was a big factory there. We just backed into that. So we'd be out of the way. We were in the building itself. And we could sit there and we watched for the tanks to come. And that's when I fired. I hit that drive sprocket. And they stopped. And then I didn't waste any time. My loader told him to load up. And then I hit him a second time. And that destroyed that tank.
The city of Dessau surrenders to the Americans on April 23, 1945. 7 days after the Americans take Dessau, Adolf Hitler commits suicide. And the next day, the Russians capture Berlin. On May 8, 1945, the war in Europe ends with Germany's unconditional surrender. For the Americans, the campaign has been long and bloody, against an enemy who didn't relent, from the beaches of Normandy to the streets of Berlin.
The casualties the U.S. suffered in April 1945 were about the same as what they suffered in June 1944. Around 10,000 deaths. So even though it seemed like the war's over, the Germans are giving up, they're still fighting to the end.
For the 3rd Armored Division, their place at the vanguard of the 1st Army earns them the nickname Spearhead Division.
The 3rd Armored Division was the first one to go through the Siegfried Line, first one to fire an artillery shell on German soil, first one to shoot down a German plane on German soil. We really earned that name of Spearhead. That's all there was to it.
And being at the spearhead comes with a cost.
The 3rd Armored Division lost over 600 tanks, 2,500 killed, 10,000 who were injured. More tanks and more men than any other armored division in World War II.
I lost my loader, a good friend, and some other buddies, and I realized, Nate, grow up. I was an 18-year-old kid, and I became an 18-year-old man in a short time.
(1968). It is the bloodiest year of the Vietnam War. American tanks are caught up in the thick of the fighting.
There's a common misconception that tanks, were not used very much in Vietnam.
The tank commander said, "Bring it to the left, bring it to the left. Start shooting."
To win the war, the Americans unleashed the military might of their armored forces.
Our 2 tanks put out savage firepower.
But the North Vietnamese fight back, sending their own tanks into battle.
Next thing I remember seeing was a round coming toward us.
Now North and South fight to decide the fate of Vietnam. Tank versus tank.
In the final phase of the war, the North Vietnamese armor really did prove decisive.
The city of Hue in central Vietnam. With its historic citadel and temples, Hue has long been revered by the Vietnamese people as the old imperial capital and a center of their culture. But today, many buildings lie in ruin, riddled with shell and bullet holes, scarred by the fighting during what the Vietnamese people call the American War. (1968). War is raging in Vietnam as forces from North and South battle for control of the country. Since 1954, Vietnam has been divided into North and South along the 17th parallel. The North is led by Ho Chi Minh, who is fighting to unify all of Vietnam.
The partition of the country into 2 parts, which the leaders in the North, primarily Ho Chi Minh, simply refused to accept. It was always their goal to reunite Vietnam as a single country.
More than just a national conflict, the fighting in Vietnam is also a front line in the global Cold War between America and Russia.
The American interest in the Vietnam War was directly related to the Cold War. It was to prevent Soviet influence in Asia.
They thought if South Vietnam fell, next to fall would be Indonesia and the Philippines, and all of Asia would become communist.
By 1965, American leaders believed the only way to stop Ho Chi Minh's fighters is by committing U.S. ground forces to Vietnam. On March 8th, a small expeditionary force of 3,500 Marines and 2 platoons of tanks lands at Da Nang. The Americans are caught up in wave after wave of guerrilla attacks by the communists. Ambushes, rocket-propelled grenades, and landmines inflict heavy casualties on the Americans.
The American tanks weren't ready for the Vietnam War in 1965. But the broader point has to be made: the American military establishment wasn't ready.
In an effort to crush the enemy, the U.S. increases its troop levels to 500,000, while its armored force grows to hundreds of tanks.
From 1965 to 1968, the American numbers and tanks increased in South Vietnam because they believed the communists were going to launch more conventional operations.
Northern commanders are indeed preparing a large offensive. In 1968, they will attack all across South Vietnam during the Lunar New Year holiday known as Tet. And the Americans will now have the opportunity they want to destroy the enemy with their overwhelming firepower.
They believed if they could bring the communists to a conventional battle, they could defeat them.
January 1968. A fateful year in the Vietnam War begins. In Hue City, the streets are crowded with Vietnamese celebrating the New Year. And amongst them are thousands of communist fighters who have infiltrated the city disguised as civilians. January 31st. Explosions rock the city. The Tet Offensive begins. 75,000 communists attack villages and cities across South Vietnam. And nowhere is the fighting more fierce than the city of Hue. American and South Vietnamese defenders are overwhelmed as guerrilla fighters appear out of nowhere. Within a day, the communists control much of Hue.
The city of Hue had particular symbolic importance to the South Vietnamese, as it was the ancient capital of the country.
American and South Vietnamese reinforcements rushed to the scene, including M48 tanks from the Marine Corps' 3rd Tank Battalion.
We'd always trained that we're going to be in the jungle and we're going to be in the scrub and in this third world country, and all of a sudden we're in a city. I got there and some of the buildings were burned up and there were fires going on in the city, and they actually were fighting street by street and house by house. And they'd call us and say, "Okay, saddle up," and we'd jump in the tanks and take off.
The M48 Patton is ideal for tank-on-tank combat, with a 90mm gun and 110mm of frontal armor. But on city streets, it is vulnerable to anti-tank weapons fired at close range.
Urban combat is always nasty because you're fighting at extremely close ranges. It's like fighting in a 3-dimensional maze.
We got to a corner of a street. I'm looking through this tiny little periscope. All of a sudden, kind of in the distance, I see a couple figures running. The tank commander said, "Where? Bring it to the left, bring it to the left." He said, "Bring it further to the left and start shooting." And 9 times out of 10, you didn't even know what you're shooting at, you just shoot. We'd have this 5 minutes of crazy action, and then we pull back.
But in Hue, there is no front line to pull back from. The fighting is everywhere.
We'd park the tanks and wait for the next call to action. And I didn't want to get out of the tank the first time because the North Vietnamese were all around.
Tanks in particular are vulnerable because any place that you have open windows, open doorways, rubble of buildings, the tank can be attacked from ground level, the tank can be attacked from above.
Two tanks were next to each other, two tank crewmen who had been out. They were all sitting around. The North Vietnamese mortar came in right in between the two tanks and took 2 or 3 of the guys out. Of the 14 or 15 crewmen that went up there that first day, almost every one of them had been medevaced out and had been replaced by somebody else.
When you came in country in a combat zone like Vietnam, they give you a little time to kind of acclimate and you get some orientation as to what to expect, but there was no time for that with Tet. We found out that we were going to be going into Hue. And we walked in, and that's where we first found the vehicle. That's the tank that I wound up on. We were basically replacing the crew that got hit. And I found myself as a replacement gunner. It was in pretty horrible shape. It was to be expected. You know, the tank commander had basically had his face taken off. So there was blood around the tank commander's cupola, and you could see it inside the turret.
The interior of the tank might be covered with blood, body parts, things like this, but they just stuck you in that tank and you kept going.
So I thought, oh my God, what's going to happen now? All I remember is the platoon commander telling us what to expect. You know, this was not tank country, he says, we're going to be going down streets.
In an urban environment, tanks suffer the disadvantage that they're constrained to the roads and areas they can move through. So the communists could more easily lay ambushes in areas where they believed the tanks would go.
Guys might be hanging out the window, trying to drop a satchel charge on top. If somebody's firing at you with heavy weapons out in front, you're basically stuck in the street and all you can do is back up. But the tank goes a lot slower than the stuff he's firing at you.
Days after the armored reinforcements arrive, the Americans still cannot dislodge the communists from Hue.
The United States was concerned about public opinion in the Battle of Hue, in that having the Vietnamese communists seize the city for a period of time was embarrassing.
As the fighting drags on, U.S. commanders worry that images of tanks destroying the historic city will anger the American public.
The rules of engagement in Hue were more restrictive because it was an urban area.
And one of the odd things about this war came home to me as fact. I had heard about it, but I thought it was just the veterans kind of putting on the new guys. They were telling me that sometimes they found themselves in a firefight and had to request permission to fire back. I said, no, that doesn't happen. I was going down a street, and I just happened to be looking through a gunner's scope at a window in a building, and I saw this flash. And a branch from a tree just flew off, like something had hit it. I'm looking at this building. Driver saw the weapon, but I didn't know what he had.
The RPGs were the North Vietnamese primary anti-tank weapons. They were essentially a reusable grenade launcher, but it was absolutely deadly to crews.
I tell the tank commander, let me put a round in there. He says, no, wait. For what? He has to call in and request permission to fire. Had visions of 900 rocket-propelled grenades all pumping holes into the tank and turning it into a gazebo. Time kind of slowed down. The tank commander got his permission, and before he had the word fire out of his mouth, I put a hole in the building.
The communists are finally driven from Hue, but much of the city lies in ruins. American casualties are high, and confidence in a swift victory in Vietnam is shaken.
The American public opinion was the great casualty of the Tet Offensive. Prior to the Tet Offensive, American politicians said, "We can see the light at the end of the tunnel. We are about to defeat the Vietnamese communists." The fact that the Vietnamese communists could launch a major offensive across South Vietnam suggested that the light was nowhere near the end of the tunnel.
40,000 South Vietnamese civilians are casualties of the Tet Offensive, and over 45,000 communist fighters are dead or wounded. Yet Ho Chi Minh's forces still fight on other battlegrounds, where they hope to turn the tide of war. The remote mountains of central Vietnam. A rusting American tank recalls fierce battles that raged here in 1968. A reminder that the North Vietnamese were entering a new phase of the war with a new weapon, their own tanks.
The NVA had tanks as early as 1959. However, they were in a school. They didn't employ their tanks in battle until 1968. At that point, the NVA were equipped with the PT-76. It was a Soviet-made tank, an amphibious tank. It was useful to infiltrate South Vietnam so that they could move them from North Vietnam through the number of water courses they would have had to cross.
And now the NVA will use their tanks to spearhead a major attack to seize the large American combat base at Khe Sanh. They will infiltrate from North Vietnam through Laos and across the border along Highway 9 and attack Khe Sanh.
It was believed that the overrun of Khe Sanh would be a prelude to a much larger operation to take parts of the northern provinces of South Vietnam. Had they been able to take the northern provinces, it would represent a discernible victory.
Highway 9, South Vietnam, January 1968. The NVA begin their advance along the highway. NVA infantry and tanks will attack their main objective, Khe Sanh. First, they must take a small U.S. Special Forces base, which guards the route, just 10 kilometers away at Lang Vei. The North Vietnamese mass nearly 2,000 troops and 16 tanks to attack Lang Vei. Defending the base are just 24 American Special Forces soldiers, supported by 450 local mercenaries.
Well, we got a call from the captain at Lang Vei that said, okay, Long Greer, go ahead and bring your troops on in. We're going to disperse you around the perimeter so that we can defend this camp. He said the other night that there was some tanks over in Laos. He said he thought there was about 3 or 4 of them. And I said, okay, why are you telling us? Tanks had never been used in the South Vietnamese War before, and what was going over in Laos was their business. So when we moved in, we established our position, started digging bunkers and everything.
The North Vietnamese artillery in the mountains begins firing on Lang Vei Special Forces base.
They could look right down on top of us. So they were putting some pretty effective fire on us every night.
February 6th, 1968. Night falls over Lang Vei.
And so at this point, we feel like this may be it.
The communists are about to unleash their attack. Leading the assault will be PT-76s from the NVA's 198th Tank Battalion. The PT-76 is a Soviet-designed light tank with a crew of 3. It's armed with a 76.2 millimeter main gun, but it has only 17 millimeters of frontal armor.
When
the North used tanks at Lang Vei for the first time, it represented the beginning of a shift in their strategy. They were prepared to blend conventional operations with guerrilla operations.
As the PT-76s reach the perimeter wire of the base, the sudden appearance of so many NVA tanks catches the Americans by surprise.
Sergeant in the bunker with me, he said, "Sir, I only got one thing to tell you. We got tanks in the wire." I said, "Are you serious? Tanks in the wire? Let's go, man." All of a sudden, I'm like, whoa, God, look at that. That's a Russian tank, man. It's a PT-76.
The Americans scramble from their bunkers and ready their main anti-tank weapon, the 106mm recoilless rifle.
And then boom, the 106 goes off. They knocked out the first tank, opened the breech, put in the second round, knocked out the second tank, put in a round, knocked out the third tank.
But the Americans are soon out of ammunition for the 106s, just as the NVA sends more tanks into the attack. The Americans fire mortars to try and stop the second wave of tanks. But the NVA press on. A PT-76 tank bears down on Longrear.
And so I dropped down below the wall, you know. I had a light anti-tank weapon. And I open it up, pull the safety out.
The M72 light anti-tank weapon, or LAW, fires a 66mm high-explosive anti-tank round that should penetrate the armor of a PT-76.
I click it and I throw it down. Give me another one.
The LAW is proving unreliable, and the PT-76 tank is closing.
So I tried 3 of these things, and they wouldn't fire. So the third one, I lined up the sight right at the very front where I thought the driver would be on the tank. I go, and I can watch the round. It's going down through like that, and hits right where I'm at. Boom! And goes straight up in the air. I'm like, it's not supposed to do that.
The rocket bounces harmlessly off the PT-76. Now the tank crew turn their attention to the American bunker.
And then the tank stops. Clank, clank, clank. He goes, starts moving his big barrel toward us, you know. And I thought, yeah, it's time to get out of this bunker.
The North Vietnamese have adopted the American tactic of using the overwhelming firepower of the tank. Lang Vei's defenders are on the verge of defeat. After a few hours of combat, the North Vietnamese control most of the Lang Vei base. Longrear and the remaining special forces fall back to their last defendable position, the Tactical Operations Center, or TOC.
Which is this underground bunker where all the radios and the command signals go out and everything.
The NVA lose no time in pressing home their attack on the defenders in the Tactical Operations Center.
And sure enough, we hear a tank. And here he comes. Boom, 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 boom.
But the Americans have learned a lesson about the PT-76.
And I said, I think we can kill him from the side. I said, don't shoot him in the front, it don't work. We fire that LAW on that tank. Boom. So we knocked that one out, and here comes one behind it. And so I fired. but it doesn't kill it. They can't go anywhere. It knocked the track off. So now they're swinging the gun around. So I still have a law on my shoulder. And I went ahead and fired it.
Another PT-76 is destroyed. The relentless NVA tank attack closes in on Longrear and the defenders.
Another tank comes out. And here we go with the old... So I knew what was fixing to happen.
Desperately short of anti-tank weapons, Longrear heads into the talk to look for more.
So I took off downstairs. Just as I get to the bottom, boom! And the concussion knocked me through the entrance. So that was pretty much the beginning of the end for us.
The NVA tanks have overrun Lang Vei. Trapped in the talk bunker, the Americans refuse to surrender.
I mean, they were hanging through the hole, throwing hand grenades and shooting and stuff, and all of a sudden, this tank pulls up on top of this bunker. We can see the dirt falling off the seats going.
Driving a several-ton steel beast and pivoting it over and over again above the bunker was likely, in their minds, to have caused a surrender.
But Lang Vei's defenders hold out in the bunker. In an act of desperation, they call for an airstrike on the NVA, who are on top of their own position.
Such decisions are never taken lightly. They're going to engage in something that might sacrifice their own lives for a greater good.
The dangerous tactic pays off as the aerial strikes force NVA tanks and infantry to pull back and allow the American-led troops to escape. On February 7th, the North Vietnamese finally take Lang Vei. They lose 7 tanks in the attack, but prove their armor can be decisive against the Americans. With Lang Vei eliminated, the NVA now focus their attack on the large American base at nearby Khe Sanh. In Khe Sanh, the survivors from Lang Vei, including Longrear, are arriving. Of the 24 American Special Forces, 21 are casualties. But they find they have traded one version of hell for another. Khe Sanh is under an intense artillery barrage, with shells landing every 10 seconds.
In early 1968, Khe Sanh was surrounded. It had been isolated by North Vietnamese forces immediately prior to the Tet Offensive and subjected to a prolonged bombardment.
The North Vietnamese besiege Khe Sanh, trapping some 6,600 Marines and South Vietnamese troops, and a detachment of M48 tanks.
I volunteered for a tank assignment and volunteered to go to Khe Sanh. The siege of Khe Sanh to me personally was, I hope, the closest I'll ever get to hell.
Advancing on the American base is a battalion from the NVA's 325C Division, numbering some 600 troops. They prepare to assault the outpost on Hill 64, near the west end of Khe Sanh Combat Base, and a position known as the Rock Quarry.
The rock quarry was a knoll where there were two tanks, one in front of and one in back of each other, kind of hidden from the enemy.
February 8th, 1968. In the early hours of the morning, NVA soldiers close on the American perimeter.
We would come out very voraciously at night, looking for enemy with our Xeon scope. They dug trenches and tunnels leading up to our lines until they were 50 to 100 meters from our trenches and our lines.
NVA soldiers crawl silently forward to place explosives under the barbed wire.
They could melt through our lines like a hot knife through butter. Of course, we didn't know what was coming.
And now NVA commanders give the signal to attack.
And I distinctly heard the bugle, and I knew what it meant. And saw the flares.
It is the signal to detonate dynamite and blast holes in the perimeter wire. NVA machine guns and mortars begin firing into the base.
We were hit with a barrage of artillery, mortars.
NVA infantry storm up the hill towards the American positions.
It was Alpha 19's outpost. It was on Hill 64. And they were being overrun.
The Marines pull out of their bunkers and withdraw. The NVA reach the top of Hill 64, intent on destroying the American positions.
But there was just a couple things that were in the way of it, and that was two tanks.
In places like Khe Sanh, tanks couldn't hold ground, but they could certainly try to prevent someone else from taking it.
The American tanks maneuver behind the enemy attackers, but are forced to fire on their own positions, now held by the NVA.
So we've got to put some heat in there, and that's what the tank commander and that's what the gunner were screaming and yelling and called for. We fired a dozen and a half rounds. And we put many of those right into the same bunkers that our troops were in only minutes before. Our tanks put out savage firepower.
The counterattack forces the NVA to withdraw, but not before they demolish the American bunkers. In the battle for Hill 64, the North Vietnamese lose 150 dead.
Tanks played a critical role in the siege of Khe Sanh. We displayed to the enemy that we could be at any point that they would choose, and that we could be there in a matter of moments.
The NVA lose thousands of men attacking Khe Sanh. The siege is finally lifted in April. But soon after, the Americans withdraw altogether from the base that they had fought so hard to keep. (1968) is the deadliest year of the war for the United States, with over 15,000 Americans killed in combat. The death toll fuels the anti-war movement, with protests erupting throughout the U.S. and around the world.
1968 does represent a turning point for the American will to fight. What the American public discovered was that they were going to have to pay a much greater cost to save South Vietnam from the communists. And it's at that point that the American public began to turn in much larger numbers than it had before.
While the United States grows weary of the war, the North Vietnamese remain determined to continue fighting and defeat their enemies. New offensives are planned, and tanks will be crucial as the communist campaign to unite the country expands. Ho Chi Minh's guerrilla fighters are now a modern army, ready to take on the most powerful nation on earth. 1969. To replenish their forces in South Vietnam, the NVA moved troops, supplies, and tanks to the south via the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a series of routes running thousands of kilometers through the jungles.
The Ho Chi Minh Trail was a nickname of the communist route for communications, logistics, and infiltration into South Vietnam.
To disrupt the enemy's supply chain, the Americans have a line of fire bases along the Ho Chi Minh Trail from which to attack the communists. One of the most isolated is Ben Het Special Forces Camp, located in South Vietnam's Central Highlands, near where the Ho Chi Minh Trail runs through neighboring Laos and Cambodia.
Ben Het was an important objective. Because of its location, had they been able to take Ben Het, it would have opened the door to operations that might cut the country in two.
The base occupies 3 hills, with the West Hill nearest the trail. It's protected by the tanks of B Company from the U.S. Army's 1st Battalion, 69th Armored Regiment. In early 1969, NVA commanders decide to assault Ben Het. Spearheading the attack on the base are up to 10 PT-76 tanks.
The NVA believed that tanks would play a decisive role at Ben Het.
March 3rd, 1969. 3 M48 tanks are dug in on the West Hill, protecting Ben Het Fire Base.
We had them dug in. They were in trenches, you know. All that was sticking out was a gun tube and what have you.
As night falls over the base, all is quiet. Until the Americans hear engine noises coming from across the nearby border.
Special Forces unit had a team out with one of their lieutenants, and they reported that there was tanks moving down around the area between us and the borders. And we got our night vision scopes out and devices and started looking. We saw the PT-76s out there.
The first tank-on-tank battle of the Vietnam War is about to begin.
To be honest, we're surprised overall that it was coming our way.
Ben Het does represent a tank-on-tank action by accident. I have difficulty believing the North Vietnamese would employ a PT-76 against an M48.
2 PT-76s are quickly knocked out. But the third closes on the American tanks and opens fire.
The next thing I remember seeing was a round coming toward us. The closer it got to us, the bigger that round looked. It looked to me like he was going over, but it didn't. It hit the loader's hatch, and when it did, it blew a tank commander out of the cupolas. It blowed me off the back deck. He and I wound up 15, 20 foot behind the tank. He cut the lower 2 crewmen who were to my left half in 2, each one of them. half of them on the back deck, and the other half on the ground.
The PT-76 shell has killed and wounded the crew of the M48, putting it out of action. The remaining U.S. tanks pummel the NVA attackers. Finally, the communists withdraw.
At the first break of dawn the next morning is when they saw at least 2 tanks had been destroyed.
Though the North Vietnamese will launch more infantry and artillery attacks in the months that follow, they fail to capture Ben Het. But the tank-on-tank battle fought here marks a deadly escalation in the conflict.
The use of tanks by the NVA represents an increase in the NVA's confidence and ability to wage conventional war.
By July 1969, more than 40,000 Americans have died in Vietnam. And there is still no end of the war in sight. On September 2nd, North Vietnamese leader Ho Chi Minh dies. But his dream of a united, independent Vietnam lives on.
You can kill 10 of our men for everyone we kill of yours. But even at those odds, you will lose and we will win.
The Americans start peace talks with the North Vietnamese and announce they will begin pulling out their troops.
We have adopted a plan which we have worked out in cooperation with the South Vietnamese for the complete withdrawal of all U.S. combat ground forces.
The American tankers had been among the first to arrive in South Vietnam. When the U.S. believed they could win a swift victory with their overwhelming firepower, now they are amongst the first to head home. As North Vietnam moves from guerrilla to conventional warfare, their tankers prepare to play a greater role in their fight to unite the country. And as the American war is ending, the fighting in Vietnam enters its decisive phase. 1972. Most American forces have withdrawn from Vietnam, leaving the South alone to defend itself.
Because of the American withdrawal, the South Vietnamese economy was weaker. They didn't have as much money to spend on their own defense.
The North, however, strengthens its forces, with help from the Soviet Union and Communist China, who supply them with powerful new tanks.
Soviet aid allowed them to rebuild their forces for future operations. The North Vietnamese did believe that they could defeat the South in a conventional war in 1972.
Spring 1972. The Communists launch a new offensive. The attack will be their largest of the war, and it will be spearheaded by hundreds of tanks.
When people think of Vietnam and tanks, most people make the assumption it's jungle. But there were areas that were very, very good for the employment of tanks, particularly the northern provinces.
The main tank assault falls on the border provinces, where the Communists believe the enemy is weakest.
This was the first time the North Vietnamese used tanks en masse during the war in Vietnam.
For the attack, the North Vietnamese field 30,000 troops and more than 150 tanks. Defending the northern provinces are nearly 30,000 South Vietnamese troops and dozens of M48 tanks. March 30th, 1972. The attack begins as NVA troops swarm across the border into South Vietnam. With them come 2 regiments of armor, which includes the most modern tank they have, the T54, The T54 is a Soviet-designed main battle tank. Intended for tank-on-tank warfare, it's armed with a 100mm main gun and has nearly 10 centimeters of frontal armor. The NVA planned to use their tanks to capture the provincial capitals of Quang Tri and Hue, giving them control of the northern provinces. In order to do so, they must cross a vital bridge over the Kua Viet River at the town of Dong Ha.
The Dong Ha Bridge was important because it could handle armored traffic. Had it fallen into communist hands, they would have been able to continue further south and get to Saigon.
As the NVA tanks close in on Dong Ha, the South Vietnamese Army rushes its newly formed 20th Tank Battalion to defend the bridge. They have 42 M48 tanks and are ordered to hold Dong Ha at all costs. The South Vietnamese tanks take up position on high ground overlooking the bridge. They wait for the NVA tanks to come into range. As the NVA tanks approach the bridge, they enter a killing zone. The South Vietnamese open fire with deadly accuracy. "11 enemy tanks are hit. But a T54 reaches the bridge and starts across. A lone South Vietnamese Marine aims to stop it with an anti-tank weapon. If the bridge is captured intact, the NVA can advance to Quang Tri City. His first shot misses. He has one rocket left. His second shot jams the enemy's turret. The disabled T-54 pulls back. The defenders blow the bridge. Stopping the NVA tanks from crossing. The communist offensive continues for another 7 months, by which time the North loses hundreds of tanks. But they gain control of some 10% of South Vietnam.
The Vietnamese communists believed the end was in sight.
In early 1975, the NVA mounts yet another offensive. Their tanks begin to attack southern positions and advance towards the capital, Saigon. April 30th, 1975. As the last Americans flee, tanks of the NVA's 203rd Armored Regiment roll into Saigon.
One of the iconic images of the war is one of those tanks pushing down the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon.
The Vietnam War is finally over. The entire country is now ruled by the communists.
In the final climactic phase of the war, the North Vietnamese armor really did prove decisive.
Over 5 million Vietnamese people die in the battles that raged in the war for Vietnam. The war cemeteries and memorials bear witness to the terrible price they paid to be unified and independent. The South Pacific, 1942. The U.S. Marine Corps leads the attack on the Pacific Islands of the Japanese Empire. And for the first time in their history, they launch an amphibious assault with tanks.
They knew they would have to have that type of support to knock out defensive positions in amphibious assaults.
All of a sudden, our tank hit a hole. They were throwing everything but the kitchen sink at that thing.
People say, well, I didn't realize there were tanks in the Pacific.
They seize one island fortress after another.
There's no real way to carry a large cannon around the battlefield for direct fire infantry support except a tank.
But they face an enemy ready to meet them tank versus tank.
Man, we were firing and firing and firing.
Fighting across a battlefield as wide as the ocean itself.
If you hit them, they're gone.
Tanks go head-to-head in the Pacific War. Today, the palm-fringed beaches of the South Pacific are a destination for holidaymakers seeking paradise. But in World War II, they would become a blood-soaked graveyard for the U.S. Marine Corps. In December 1941, the Japanese launch a surprise attack against the United States naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Striking at the heart of American power in the Pacific and dragging the U.S. into the Second World War. For more than 50 years, the Japanese have been pursuing a policy of aggressive military expansion. Their empire now stretches halfway across the Pacific Ocean from mainland Asia. The Japanese military machine has been unstoppable, swallowing one island chain after another. From the Marianas to the Gilberts and to the Solomons.
Japan's strategy was pretty effective at this particular point because basically they had managed to run riot all through the southern Pacific. They had things pretty much their own way.
Each island in its possession is now a fortress, bristling with manpower and heavy armor.
The goal was to make it so expensive for the Americans to come back and to counterattack them that the Americans would lose hope and simply give up on recovering or counterattacking the Japanese and seizing back this empire.
But give up, they did not. And in June 1942, with a decisive naval victory at the Battle of Midway, the Americans turned the tide of war.
A common saying is that before Midway, the Japanese never stopped advancing. After Midway, the Japanese never stopped retreating.
The Americans go on the offensive, and it's the Marines who are tasked with rolling back the Japanese empire across 6,000 kilometers of ocean, with the plan to seize one island stronghold after another until they reach mainland Japan itself. Overshadowed by the achievements of the infantry, the role of the tank in the Pacific War has been untold.
People say, well, I didn't realize there were tanks in the Pacific.
There's very little written about the tanks in the case of the Marine Corps. The infantry always has this strange love-hate relationship with tanks. They don't like to be around the tank because it takes fire, but when you're taking fire from an enemy position, there's nothing quite like that direct fire cannon and those heavy machine guns and that armored protection to help eliminate enemy positions. There's no real way to carry a large cannon around the battlefield for direct fire infantry support except a tank.
The Marines' first hurdle is Guadalcanal, which they seek to take with overwhelming force, including 20,000 troops and more than 50 light tanks. But it becomes a protracted and bloody campaign. Not only are the Pacific Islands garrisoned by tens of thousands of soldiers, but the Japanese are also fanatical in defense.
They never give up. You either kill them or get killed. This is war. They don't give up.
And crucially, the U.S. Marines' frontline armored weapon, the M3 light tank, proves a failure.
The light tanks did not possess enough firepower with their small 37mm cannons to do much against the major Japanese defenses.
So the light tanks of the Marine Corps are replaced with the Sherman. The medium M4A2 Sherman tank, with a 75mm main cannon, its firepower is a significant upgrade in the Marines' armored capability.
How do they compare? Like night and day. It was kind of like comparing a small Ford to a big Cadillac.
With the lessons learned at Guadalcanal, a victory that takes 6 months and comes at a cost of more than 7,000 casualties, the U.S. Marines move on to their next objective, Tarawa. 6,000 kilometers from Tokyo and part of the Gilbert Island chain, Tarawa is at the outermost edge of the Japanese Pacific Empire. It's a remote and sparsely populated atoll of tiny islands and coral reefs.
The Japanese realized, having executed several amphibious assaults themselves, that the best place to defeat an amphibious assault is at the water's edge, where the troops are still wading ashore, where they're still knee-deep and struggling. So most of their defenses were sited around the perimeter of the island.
So confident is Japanese Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, he boasts that 1 million men could not take the island in 1,000 years. Dug in behind the defensive seawall at Tarawa are 5,000 soldiers, 65 heavy guns, and 7 tanks.
These islands were so small that the entire perimeter of the island could be fortified. So there was no chance except to assault these things frontally.
Advancing on Tarawa, the Americans now have 14 medium tanks, dozens of light tanks, and 20,000 Marines. November 20th, 1943. At 0500 hours, the American attack begins with a massive naval bombardment. Its aim, to destroy the Japanese defenses and breach the seawall.
We could see the planes dive bombing the island. The heavy cruisers were there. They had 12-inch guns, and they were blasting the island like crazy.
What I was worried about is I was worried about one of them things might hit me.
At 0900 hours, the first wave of Marines go in.
On a small island like Tarawa, the only thing you can do is attack right into the teeth of the defenses, just kind of slog ashore and try to do the best you can in this frontal assault.
Three waves of Amtraks lead the attack, followed by C Company with 14 Shermans. A kilometer from the beaches, they're unloaded on a coral reef.
Then you go into the lagoon, then you go in. And that's when things got rough.
Because it's now that the U.S. tankers come within range of the Japanese heavy guns.
All our positions on all beaches opened on the enemy landing craft. The Americans appeared to be surprised and confused.
Wading ashore through 3 feet of water under murderous fire, the tankers encounter an unforeseen hazard. The shell holes created by their own naval bombardment.
All of a sudden, our tank hit a hole. They was under fire. I mean, they were throwing everything but the kitchen sink at that thing. So I opened the hatch and slid down the back of the tank into the water. And I don't know how I did it without getting hit, because all I could hear in the water was put all over.
And of the 6 tanks I had on that beach, 3 of them drowned out in the water. But we did get ashore. I got ashore with 3 vehicles.
But far from being destroyed, the Japanese seawall is still intact, barring their way and effectively trapping them on the beach.
The tank you can't drive over that 5-foot seawall.
And they had built, in some cases, positions actually into or just atop the seawall. It was a very effective defense with interlocking fields of fire.
What remains of C Company must now run the gauntlet of the anti-tank guns, desperate to find a breach through the seawall.
And if they could manage to fire into the area behind the tracks, they could penetrate the very thin armor there. They would simply pump rounds into these tanks until they were destroyed or caught fire.
Two tanks from Bale's company find a gap in the seawall and make it off the beach. It has now taken the U.S. Marines 6 hours to establish a beachhead on Tarawa. And the cost has been high, with 50% of their tank capability already destroyed.
Looking back on it, we're pretty naive, because the intelligence did not reveal the true nature of the Japanese defenses, the tenacity of the Japanese.
But with the seawall breached, the tables have now been turned.
It was strange. All the Japanese defenses were oriented seaward, and we were on shore.
So that once you could get in behind these things, you could knock them out by attacking the rear entrances without coming under so much intense fire.
You had to find the opening, because these things were dug into the ground and they were covered with mounds and mounds of sand. We realized you had to start firing into the openings. But we had not gone more than 100 yards inland, and we ran into this Japanese tank showed up. When I saw him, and I caught him out of the corner of my eye, this movement, and I realized what it was. The Japanese tank stuck its turret up over a revetment. I told the gunner, and he started to traverse over there. He probably had to traverse that gun 30, 40 degrees to get on that target. And he fired before I told him to. And he missed. That was a prepared position for the Japanese tank, where it could sit there and then pull up, put its turret and gun up over the revetment and fire. And that's what it did.
The Ha-Go light tank, armed with a 37mm main gun. In a straight fight, it should prove no match for the medium Sherman M4.
That projectile hit right on the end of our gun tube. Took a piece out of our gun tube and fragments came down the tube and it lit up like a Christmas tree. It was a lucky shot. It was a lucky shot.
Bale's tank is disabled, but he has backup.
The other tank that was with us fired. And that other tank fired, and all I know is he blew the turret off.
We call them a tin can. And that's what they are. I mean, compared with our tanks.
It takes 3 days for the Marines to clear the atoll. 4,700 Japanese are killed, including Rear Admiral Shibasaki, with only 17 choosing to surrender. And in the space of just 76 hours, the Marines themselves lose nearly 1,000.
Tarawa caused a major change in the way the United States viewed the war and the attitudes, particularly. Because up to that point, on the home front, movies had always, depicted people with relatively bloodless shoulder wounds or people dying with a noble, quip on their lips. But for the first time, the Commandant of the Marine Corps authorized the release of photographs of American casualties, including dead Marines on the beach, dead Marines floating in the lagoon, and he made the comment, "There is no royal road to Tokyo."
Having punctured the Japanese Empire's first line of defense in the Pacific at Tarawa in the Gilbert Islands, the Americans now advance on the Marianas and the island of Saipan.
The Japanese considered the Marianas actually the last defensive line before the home islands.
Much bigger than Tarawa and halfway to Japan itself, the Marianas hold the strategic key to the war in the Pacific. The Japanese know that if their airstrips on the Marianas are captured, American superfortress bombers will for the first time be within range of Tokyo itself.
So they were prepared to defend these things with a major effort.
June 15th, 1944. The U.S. Marines launched their amphibious assault.
Saipan was the first of the real large land masses that the Marines attacked during the course of the Pacific War. So the Japanese could not have as heavy a defense of the beaches themselves.
We did not encounter the bomb craters and all off the beach. We didn't encounter the heavy Japanese gunfire from emplacements. And as far as I was concerned, I got my company ashore pretty easily.
Unlike on Tarawa, the main Japanese defenses are situated behind the shoreline. And as the U.S. Marines advance off the beaches, they discover the Japanese are waiting for them, dug into a network of almost impregnable bunkers.
Oh, they had pillboxes all over, and they were connected underground. So they were in a pillbox over here firing, and before you know it, they'd go underground to another one and come up again.
which means the U.S. Marines have to clear and destroy each defensive position, one by one.
So the Marines not only had to kill the defenders of position, they had to physically destroy that position to keep it from being reoccupied.
And the only way they can do that is to burn them out, using the newest weapon in the U.S. Marines armory. The Saipan flame tank is a reconditioned Stuart M3 light tank. Its 37mm main cannon refitted with a Canadian-designed Ronson flamethrower.
It was an absolutely deadly weapon against any sort of fixed position because it doesn't really kill the enemy by burning, but it consumes all the oxygen and suffocates even somebody inside a closed position.
With a range of just 55 meters, the flamethrowers are only effective at close quarters.
The flame tank had to approach within a certain distance, rendering itself vulnerable to enemy counterattack by infantry with these little grenade mines or a suicide weapon they called the lunge mine, an anti-tank mine on the end of a bamboo pole that they would come up and shove against the side of the tank. They had a lot of success sticking these against the engine doors on the light tanks where the armor was much thinner.
The Marines' advance now becomes a game of cat and mouse with the Japanese suicide bombers, with the Sherman supporting both infantry and flame tanks.
So it was simply a matter of working with the infantry and slow going and digging these people out.
Then we went down about 1,000 yards toward a big pillbox about 20 foot high. I mean the big one. I started throwing shells in there. We fired about, I'll get 8 or 10 shells at that thing. And nothing would happen, they just fell off. Just like me shooting my BB gun at my barn out here. They just hit it and roll off. Can you imagine? Nothing can get through that. We pulled back and the light tanks had flamethrowers on them. There's no way you could knock that thing out. You had to burn them out. That's the only way you could do it.
But with its limited range, the Saipan tank needs protection.
I was more concerned about being swarmed by the Japanese than I was about Japanese gunfire.
So the idea was, of course, that these escort tanks could stand off in some position off to the side, to the rear, wherever required to protect the flame tanks from this type of counterattack.
So they took flamethrowers up there and they burned them out. So as they burned them out, we picked them off.
By day's end, a beachhead has been established. But the Japanese on Saipan are far from finished. As the U.S. Marines clear the Japanese defenses on Saipan, the Japanese tank formations that have been held in reserve prepare to strike back.
The Japanese principle was always to try to counterattack. They had almost a cult of the attack and the counterattack.
Whether we attack or not, we are going to die. Let's advance together against the American devils and leave our bones on Saipan.
The problem is, it came to be a kind of a situation where they saw dying in one of these things as almost a kind of a goal into itself.
As night falls at the end of day 2, the U.S. Marines reach one of the island's airstrips. At 0330 hours, the heavy rumble of Japanese tanks can be heard approaching.
The Japanese came over this ridgeline. Must have had every tank they had on Saipan. Because I don't know if anybody ever saw any more Japanese tanks. It was a big attack for an island like that and a force like that.
They had sent in major units, including the largest single Japanese tank unit that the Americans encountered during the course of the Pacific War.
37 tanks lead the Japanese charge. A full frontal banzai-style attack, straight at the American lines.
A banzai attack is just a maze of confusion. It's just simply a horrible maze of confusion. Like anything at night, you can't see. You're not sure, but you know it's there. Can you hear it?
Man, they came up over that ridge. And man, we were firing and firing and firing.
They just came at you and kept coming.
Taking the Marines by surprise, the Japanese smash through the American front line, and the battle becomes a mass brawl of tank versus tank.
As they advanced 200 or 300 yards, they encountered the anti-tank company and this tank platoon.
It turned into just a huge melee with things all mixed in together.
Tracer bullets light up the night sky. Explosions and shell bursts illuminate the battlefield. With tanks firing at point-blank range, the Japanese Hago now finds itself hopelessly outgunned by the U.S. Sherman.
And typical Japanese tanks didn't stand a chance.
The Japanese armor, they had little light tanks there, but they didn't do any good.
Their 37mm guns were not big enough. Their armament was not heavy enough.
Our medium tanks blew the light tanks away.
Flames from the stricken tanks now enable the Americans to pick out their targets.
One of the aspects of the Japanese tanks was that they were, their design was such that in a lot of cases, you could actually knock them out with heavy machine gun fire. And there were instances where they smothered these things with enough 30 caliber heavy machine gun fire to actually get rounds through the vision embrasures, through small chinks in the armor, and kill the crew inside, disabling the tank.
We just kept mowing them down. But the more we mowed down, the more came.
This thing went on all night long. By dawn, the Americans were able to come out over the battlefield, and there were about 33 Japanese tanks, in various stages of disrepair, shall we say, strewn about the battlefield.
Well, walking around there looking at said after it was over, you know, it looked great. Looked great. It kind of looked like going out on a baseball field after your team wins a baseball game.
The action on that night succeeded in destroying about 3/4 of the major Japanese armored force on the island.
After that night attack, the Japanese had no more tanks left.
Although outnumbered and overwhelmed by superior American armor, the Japanese defenders on Saipan refused to surrender. It will take the U.S. Marines another 3 weeks to clear the island, at the end of which they will be confronted with the final horror, the mass suicide of Japanese civilians.
They were scared of the Americans.
They thought they were going to get killed, murdered, and raped.
They were up on the end of the island there, and the whole family would just jump off the cliff at one time.
Women throwing their children off the cliffs. You know, I don't know of how anybody could have stopped it.
All they really had to do is raise a white flag, and we wouldn't do nothing to them.
With the capture of Saipan and the Marianas, the Americans are now within range to launch daily bombing raids against Japan itself, in preparation for a full-scale invasion. But Iwo Jima, a tiny volcanic island situated halfway between Saipan and the Japanese mainland, remains a thorn in the American side.
It was a Japanese radar base that gave them hours of warning of the approach of the American raids. And Japanese fighter planes flying out of there were picking off crippled American bombers trying to make it back to the Marianas.
Measuring just 21 square kilometers, Iwo Jima is an unremarkable dot in the ocean. But the battle that raged here would make it infamous in the annals of the U.S. Marine Corps. February 19th, 1945. To their surprise, the Marines' amphibious landing is unopposed by the Japanese.
Contrary to the defense at the water's edge, at Iwo Jima, what they had planned to do was to actually let the Americans come ashore. The first problem that presented itself at Iwo Jima was simply the nature of the beaches. A lot of the beach sand is not sand in the sense we normally think of it, but volcanic ash. And a man jumping out of a landing craft and struggling up onto the beach, when he got into the dry sand, every step you took, you sank in up to your knees. Vehicles just floundered in it, tanks trying to advance through it. The tracks would begin to churn this material, but the tank would be sitting on its belly with its tracks churning and just throwing up ash and sinking in deeper and deeper and deeper.
When we hit the beach, that loose volcanic ash had built up into the tracks to where one of the tracks exploded.
As the first tanks advance off the beaches and get onto firmer ground, they encounter a new danger.
What they were doing was burying a 500-pound bomb about that far underground and then setting a 10-pound anti-tank mine on it.
In some cases, these were command detonated. They could be detonated electronically by somebody waiting in a nearby cave.
The American tanks push on, not knowing when or where another mine will strike.
The tank went up in the air, the turret come off and landed right side up. And the tank went over. The driver and assistant driver, they're dead before the dirt clears. Made a hole big enough to almost bury the tank in, and everybody in it was dead.
Each step taken by the U.S. Marines on Iwo Jima will be fraught with unforeseen dangers.
One military engineer who looked at the island of Iwo Jima after the battle said that it was probably the most heavily fortified place on the planet.
To protect themselves against magnetic mines, the tankers have bolted wooden planks to the sides of the Shermans. But as the Marines are about to discover, the Japanese no longer have to rely on suicide attacks. Because for the first time in the war in the Pacific, Japanese gun capability is now a match for the Sherman.
One of the major obstacles that the American tanks had to cross was two interconnected airfields on the central part of the island. And the real problem was that a lot of the Japanese anti-tank guns had been positioned to defend this open ground because they knew that this central plateau was going to be a major axis of advance for any sort of tanks. The idea was just smother them with artillery fire, and that's what they did.
There was mortars and big guns flying all over around.
It was essentially built up as one huge ambush.
The 47 on Iwo, that's the first time we met the 47s.
The breech-loading 47mm anti-tank gun. With a barrel length of 2.5 meters and a muzzle velocity of 830 meters per second, it presents the first serious challenge to U.S. armor in the Pacific.
Yeah, they would go through the tank anywhere it wanted to.
As the tanks advanced over this relatively open terrain, these 47mm anti-tank guns, and in some cases larger guns, were able to fire into the sides and rear of the tank. You know, anytime you penetrate the engine, that's going to disable the tank. So it was vulnerable, you know, to fire if it was engaged from the rear. There are photographs of tanks that have anywhere from 12 to 15 penetrations on one side of the tank alone.
Yeah, a lot of tanks were done in.
It's really always difficult to assess how many tanks were knocked out in any particular action, but the estimate for this one is somewhere around 33 or so.
The American advance is slow and the cost is high, but it's also unstoppable. And on the 5th day of the battle for Iwo Jima, the U.S. Marines plant the stars and stripes on the summit of Mount Suribachi, the highest point on the island. And Joe Rosenthal's photograph will become an iconic image, not only of the Marines' triumph, but also of their struggle. It will take another 30 days of the fiercest fighting in the whole of the Pacific War for the Americans to secure the island. And with 26,000 wounded or killed, it's the only battle in which the U.S. Marines suffer more casualties than the Japanese.
We had all kinds of good information, but whether it was going to be as bad as it was, I don't think we had any idea that it was going to be a month long, but it got dangerous. A lot of guys bought it, a hell of a lot.
By the spring of 1945, the Axis powers are on the brink of total defeat. In the Pacific War, the U.S. Marine Corps has fought 5,500 kilometers, halfway across the ocean, to reach Japanese home territory. Okinawa, 600 kilometers from the mainland, is the first of the home islands to be attacked. But with nowhere left to retreat, the Japanese are prepared to defend Okinawa and their homeland to the death.
I figured we'd have to fight the whole Japanese, you know. And it's bad because they'd fight to the last man.
April 19th, 1945. The battle for Okinawa is raging. Working in tandem with ground troops, 30 tanks advance against Japanese infantry positions on Kokuzu Ridge.
Tanks are very vulnerable to close infantry assault. When a tank comes under attack by enemy infantry, the preferred method is having your own infantry with you.
But in the heat of the battle, the U.S. tanks lose contact with their own infantry.
They sent a lot of the medium tanks out into Japanese-occupied territory unescorted by infantry.
Undefended by ground troops, the column makes a power drive through enemy lines, which are teeming with anti-tank guns.
They had all these artillery pieces and heavy anti-tank guns in caves. They'd roll them out and fire them, and they were good at it.
"22 tanks make it as far as Kokuzu Village, a booby-trapped Japanese stronghold. Where lacking any ground reconnaissance, the tankers are ambushed. Cut off, deep within enemy lines, and with no hope of reinforcement, the tankers' only chance is to blast and burn their way out.
I mean, those people are trying to kill you, and you're going to kill them. That's it.
Of the 30 tanks that set out on the mission, only 8 returned. Kokuzu Ridge is the last major tank engagement of the Pacific War, although Okinawa will not be taken for another 2 months. Losses on both sides are dreadful, with more than 100,000 fatalities. But however desperate their defense of their homeland, the Japanese cause is now hopeless. By June 1945, Okinawa is secured. On August 6th, the Enola Gay takes off from the Marianas to drop the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. And within a week of the second bomb on Nagasaki, the Japanese surrender unconditionally. Of all the campaigns of the Second World War, none was more fiercely contested than the South Pacific. For the Japanese, the cost is enormous. Total defeat and more than 2 million casualties. Casualties for the U.S. Marines alone amount to more than 95,000 men. But ultimate victory is theirs.
You do your job. You don't. All you do is get him before he gets you. That's the name of the game.
And central to the U.S. victory was the role of the tanker.
I feel proud of the tankers.
Tanks are always part of it. I've always been very proud of that tank company.
They wouldn't have went anywhere without tanks, as far as I'm concerned. But between the tanks and the ground troops, that's what took the islands.